The dust tasted of judgment. It coated Ilara's tongue, a gritty film of shame that was thicker than the grime on her skin. The sun was a merciless hammer in the vast white sky, beating down on her bowed head, on the splintery wood of the punishment. Post on the jeering faces that swam in and out of her wavering vision. Her arms, wrenched back and tied, ached with a fire that had long since burned past pain into a dull, throbbing numbness. The ropes had rubbed her wrists raw, and the dried blood was a dark bracelet against her pale skin. She had stolen a loaf of bread. Not a sack of coins, not a jewel, but a simple, dense loaf of sourdough from the mercantile, its yeasty scent a tormenting ghost of the sustenance she craved. She had been caught before she could even tear a piece from it, her fingers. Clumsy with hunger, her body trembling with a weakness that betrayed her intent. Now she was the town spectacle, a lesson in frontier justice. The sheriff, a man named Barlow with a gut that strained the buttons of his vest and eyes like two chips of flint, had paraded her through the single dusty street of redemption, his voice booming with self-righteous authority. This is what becomes of thieves. This is what we do to those who would take what ain't theirs. The words were for the town, but his sneer was for her alone. She had collapsed twice on the short walk to the square, her legs refusing to hold the meager weight of her body. He had hauled her up by the rope around her neck, the friction of the hemp searing her skin, and the laughter of the onlookers had been the cruelest blow of all. Now tied to the post, she tried to find a place in her mind to hide. She thought of her mother's hands, how they felt braiding her hair, the calluses from a life of work, a comforting roughness. She thought of her father's voice, a low rumble like distant thunder, telling stories of the green hills of Ohio they had left behind. But the memories were thin, washed-out things, leached of their color by starvation and grief. Fever had taken them both in a wagon camp 300 miles back, leaving Ilara with nothing but a tattered quilt and a name nobody knew. She had drifted for weeks, a ghost haunting the edges of civilization, her hope eroding with every sunset that left her colder and more alone than the last. The hunger was a living thing inside her, a gnawing beast with claws and teeth, and it had finally driven her to this. To public humiliation, to a slow, parched death under the Wyoming sun. A child no older than 6 pointed a sticky finger at her. "Mama, is the lady bad?" The mother pulled the child away with a sharp tug. "Don't look, Clara. Decent folk don't look at trash." The word struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow, and a single hot tear escaped her tightly. Shut eye, tracing a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. She bit down on her cracked lip until she tasted the metallic tang of blood, focusing on the small, sharp pain. It was something to hold on to, a tiny anchor in a swirling sea of despair. The hours bled into one another. The sun crawled across the sky, its heat relentless. Her throat was a desert, her tongue a swollen, useless thing in her mouth. The whispers of the townsfolk were a constant buzzing torment. "Heard she's an orphan. Came with no people. That's always a bad sign. Barlow says she be here 3 days. She won't last one." The words were distant, unreal, as if spoken in a dream. Her world had shrunk to the rough texture of the post against her cheek, the burning in her shoulders, the blinding white light behind her eyelids. She was floating, untethered from her own body, a spectator to her own demise. She prayed, not to a God she no longer believed in, but to the memory of her mother. "Mama, I'm sorry. I tried to be strong." As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting long skeletal shadows across the square, a wagon creaked to a halt at the edge of the small crowd. The sound was different from the others, slower, heavier. A man descended, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He was tall, broad-shouldered, but with a slight stoop, as if he carried an invisible weight. He wore worn denim and a faded flannel shirt, the clothes of a farmer, not a townsman. Dust clung to him, not the judgment-laced dust of the square, but the rich, dark dust of tilled earth. He moved through the onlookers who parted for him with a mixture of curiosity and deference. He did not look at them. His eyes, a startlingly pale blue in a sun-weathered face, were fixed on her. Ilara felt his gaze like a physical touch. It wasn't leering or cruel like the others. It was something else, something she couldn't name. It was heavy, filled with a silence that was louder than all the whispers combined. He stopped a few feet from her, his shadow falling over her, offering a momentary blessed relief from the sun. He looked at her face, at the tear track, at her bloody lip, at the raw, chafed skin of her wrists. His expression was unreadable, a mask of hardened indifference, but his eyes held a flicker of something ancient and deep, a sorrow that seemed to recognize her own. He was a man who knew ghosts. She could see them in the lines around his mouth, in the hollows beneath his eyes. Sheriff Barlow, sensing a challenge to his authority, swaggered over. "Something I can help you with, Silas? Come to see the show?" The farmer, Silas, didn't turn to face the sheriff. He kept his eyes on Ilara. His voice, when it came, was rough, like stones grinding together, a voice unused to speaking. "What did she take?" "A loaf of bread," Barlow scoffed. "But it ain't the bread. It's the principle. We don't tolerate thieving and redemption." Silas finally tore his gaze from Ilara and looked at the mercantile, where the owner, Mr. Abernathy, stood on the porch, looking uncomfortable. Silas walked toward him, his boots leaving deep prints in the dust. The crowd murmured, a ripple of anticipation passing through them. "What's the cost of the bread, Abernathy?" Silas asked, his voice low but carrying in the sudden quiet. Abernathy wrung his hands. "Well, Silas, it's 5 cents, but that's not the—" Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He tossed a coin onto the porch. It landed with a soft chink, then he tossed another. "That's for the bread. And that's for her trouble." He turned his gaze back to Barlow, and for the first time, Ilara saw a glint of steel beneath the weariness. "I'll take her." The words hung in the air, audacious and absolute. The square fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Barlow's face purpled with rage. "What did you say? You can't just— She's a prisoner. She's serving a sentence." "A sentence for 5 cents of bread I just paid for twice over?" Silas's voice was dangerously quiet. "I need a hand on my farm. I'll take her on as an indentured hand. The law allows for it. You can draw up the papers." It was a loophole, a forgotten bit of frontier law that favored pragmatism over punishment. A landowner could take on the debt or fine of a petty criminal in exchange for labor. It was rarely used and never for a stranger, a drifter. Barlow was sputtering, his authority crumbling before his eyes. He looked around for support, but the townsfolk were silent, their expressions a mixture of shock and a strange, grudging respect for the quiet farmer who had justified him. They all knew Silas. They knew of the tragedy that had hollowed him out years ago, the fire that had claimed his wife and son and left him a recluse on his isolated homestead. He hadn't shown this much life in a decade. It's irregular," Barlow stammered. "It's the law," Silas stated, his gaze unwavering. He turned and walked back to Ilara. He pulled a knife from his belt, the blade clean and sharp. For a terrifying second, she flinched, the instinct of a cornered animal overriding all else. But he didn't move toward her throat. He moved behind her, and with 2 swift, clean slices, he cut the ropes that bound her wrists. The sudden release of tension was agonizing. Blood rushed back into her hands with 1,000 fiery needles. Her arms, void of strength, fell uselessly to her sides. Her knees buckled, and the world tilted, the white sky and the brown dust spinning into a nauseating vortex. She would have collapsed, would have crumpled into a heap of shame at his feet, but his hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her upper arm. His grip was like iron, steady and sure, holding her up when she could not hold herself. He pulled her away from the post, turning her toward his wagon. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The entire town was his audience, watching. In stunned silence as the silent, broken farmer led the starving, disgraced girl away from her public execution. He lifted her onto the wagon seat as if she weighed nothing more than a sack of flour. His touch impersonal, functional, yet it was the first human touch she had felt in months that wasn't violent. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and, with a soft click of his tongue, set the horses in motion. As the wagon rolled out of town, leaving the square and the stunned face of Sheriff Barlow behind, Alara risked a glance at the man beside her. His face was a stone profile against the setting sun, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had not saved her out of kindness. She knew that. It was a transaction, a trade. He had bought himself a laborer. But as the last of the town's judgmental eyes fell away, and the vast, lonely expanse of the prairie opened up before them, a desperate, unanswered question echoed in the desolate chambers of her heart. What had she just been saved for? The journey to his farm was a long, rattling silence. The sun bled out across the horizon, painting the clouds in brutal hues of orange and purple, and the world cooled rapidly. Alara shivered, the thin cotton of her dress no match for the evening chill. The man, Silas, seemed not to notice. He sat straight-backed, his hands holding the reins with a practiced ease, his gaze locked on the faint track that served as a road. He was a landscape of a man, weathered and stark, carved from the same unforgiving earth they were traveling over. She was intensely aware of him, of the space he took up, of the sheer solid presence of him beside her. It was not a comforting presence, it was intimidating. A wall of silence she dared not try to breach. Her own silence was different. It was a fragile, brittle thing, the silence of exhaustion and fear. They traveled for what felt like an eternity, the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the plodding hoofbeats of the horses, the only sounds in the vast emptiness. The stars began to appear, cold and distant, scattered like salt across black velvet. Finally she saw a light, a single weak yellow square glowing in the oppressive darkness. As they drew closer, the light resolved into a window, and the dark shape around it became a cabin. It was a small, sturdy structure of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney at one end. A larger, darker shape loomed behind it, a barn. There were fenced-in areas, the dark shapes of sleeping cattle, the faint scent of hay and manure on the wind. This was his world, a world of solitude. He brought the wagon to a halt near the cabin door and climbed down. He didn't offer to help her, he simply waited. Her body was a symphony of aches. Every muscle screamed in protest as she forced herself to move, to climb down from the high seat. Her legs trembled, and she had to grip the wagon wheel for a moment to steady herself. He watched her, his face impassive in the moonlight. Then he turned and walked into the cabin, leaving the door open behind him. The message was clear: follow. She hesitated for a moment, the darkness of the prairie behind her seeming almost preferable to the unknown darkness of his home. But the wind was cold, and the gnawing hunger in her belly had returned with a vengeance. She took a deep breath and stepped over the threshold. The inside of the cabin was one room, clean to the point of being sterile. The floor was swept bare, the wooden table and two chairs scrubbed pale. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and black. A bed, neatly made with a simple wool blanket, occupied one corner. In another, a small cot, little more than a frame with some sacking stretched over it. There was no clutter, no sign of a life being lived, only of existence being maintained. No books, no carvings, no pictures, no splashes of color. It was the home of a man who was waiting for nothing. Silas was at the fireplace, striking a flint. A spark caught, and a small flame licked at the kindling he had laid. He added larger pieces of wood, and soon a small fire was crackling, pushing. back the chill and casting flickering shadows on the bare walls. He moved to a small counter where a bucket of water sat. He poured some into a tin cup and held it out to her. She took it with trembling hands, the metal cold against her fingers. She drank, the water a shock of life to her parched throat. She drank so fast she choked, and a fit of coughing racked her body. He waited patiently until it passed, his expression unchanging. He then moved to a small pantry, took out a hunk of dark bread and a piece of cheese, and set them on the table. He gestured toward them with his head. It was not an invitation, it was a command. She stumbled to the table, her eyes locked on the food. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She sat down and reached for the bread, her hand shaking so badly she could barely grasp it. She brought it to her mouth and took a bite. The taste was overwhelming. It was real. It was sustenance. The simple, earthy flavor of the bread exploded in her mouth, and she began to eat, not like a person, but like an animal, tearing off pieces and stuffing them into her mouth, barely chewing, driven by a primal, desperate need. She didn't realize. She was crying until a tear dripped from her chin onto the table. It was a sob of relief, of shame, of the sheer, overwhelming agony of being saved. She ate the entire hunk of bread and the cheese, her stomach cramping in protest at the sudden influx of food, but she couldn't stop. When she was finished, she looked up. Silas was standing by the fire, his back to her, staring into the flames. He hadn't watched her grotesque display. It was a small mercy, but it felt enormous. She sat there, her body trembling with the aftershocks of her hunger, the silence of the room pressing in on her. "The cot is yours," he said, his voice still rough but quieter now. "There's a blanket. The outhouse is out back. Be ready to work at sunrise." He didn't look at her. He banked the fire, then moved to his own bed, pulled off his boots with a thud, and lay down, turning his face to the wall. Within minutes, the steady rhythm of his breathing filled the small cabin. He was asleep, or pretending to be. Elara sat at the table for a long time, the warmth of the dying fire on her face. She was no longer a public spectacle. She was an indentured hand, a piece of property. She had traded one cage for another. She finally rose, her body stiff and sore, and made her way to the cot. The sacking was rough, the blanket thin, and smelled faintly of wood smoke and him. She lay down, curling into a tight ball, and for the first time in a very, very long time, she slept under a roof with a full stomach and was terrified. The days that followed were a blur of grueling work and heavy silence. Silas was a demanding master, not through words, but through action. He rose before the sun, and he expected her to do the same. The first morning, she was woken by the sound of him splitting wood outside. The sharp, rhythmic crack of the axe was her new alarm. He didn't call to her. He simply started his day, and she knew she was already behind. She scrambled out of the cot, her body a tapestry of new aches, and hurried outside. He pointed to the chicken coop. "Collect the eggs, feed them, then milk the cow." He demonstrated once, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he handled the chickens and worked the cow's udder. Then he handed her the pail and walked away to mend a fence, leaving her to figure it out. Her first attempts were clumsy, disastrous. The chickens scattered, squawking at her nervous movements. The cow, sensing her fear, flicked its tail impatiently and kicked over the pail twice, spilling the precious little milk she had managed to get. She sat on the small stool, her forehead pressed against the cow's warm flank, and wept in frustration. She could hear the steady thud of his hammer in the distance, a constant reminder of her own incompetence. But she didn't give up. She took a deep breath, whispered soothing words to the cow as she had seen him do, and tried again. This time, she managed a quarter of a pail. It felt like a monumental victory. Their life was a silent dance of chores. He never praised her. He never berated her. He simply observed. If she did a task wrong, he would wordlessly step in and do it correctly, the demonstration his only lesson. She learned to scrub the cabin until her knuckles were raw, to weed the sprawling vegetable garden until her back screamed. Tio washed their clothes in a large tub with harsh lye soap that stung her hands. She was not used to this life. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and cracked. The sun browned her skin and the wind chapped her lips. She grew thinner, but it was the thinness of wiry strength, not starvation. They ate their meals in silence at the small table. The food was simple: potatoes, beans, the eggs she collected, the milk she procured. He was a good hunter, and sometimes there was rabbit or venison. He ate with a focused intensity, as if the act of eating was just another chore to be completed. She tried once to break the silence. "The garden is doing well," she said, her voice small and tight in the quiet room. He looked up from his plate, his pale blue eyes meeting hers for a moment. He gave a short, sharp nod, then looked back down at his food. The wall of his silence was impenetrable. The rejection stung more than she expected. After that, she didn't. Try again. She learned about him in fragments and the things he didn't say. She saw the burn scars that snaked up his arms, disappearing under his sleeves. They were old, silvery, but they spoke of a terrible pain. She saw the way his eyes would sometimes drift to the horizon, his expression lost and haunted, and she knew he was seeing something that wasn't there. One afternoon, while cleaning the small loft above the main room, she found a small, dust-covered wooden box. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, nestled on a piece of faded velvet, was a woman's silver locket and a small, carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight, a child's toy. A wave of profound sadness washed over her. These were the ghosts. His wife, his child. She closed the box gently, put it back exactly where she found it, and never went into the loft again. The loneliness was a physical ache, almost as bad as the hunger had been. She was surrounded by the sounds of the farm, the lowing of the cattle, the cackle of the chickens, the whisper of the wind through the tall prairie grass, but the human silence was deafening. Sometimes she would talk to the cow as she milked her voice a low murmur, just to hear the sound of it. She would sing the lullabies her mother had sung to her as she weeded the garden, her voice thin and reedy in the vast emptiness. One evening, a brutal early autumn storm rolled in. The wind howled like a banshee, and rain lashed against the cabin in sheets. The roof, she discovered, leaked. A steady drip, drip, drip began to fall right over her cot. She placed a pail underneath it, the rhythmic plinking of the water, a new form of torture. She lay there, shivering, trying to find a dry spot on the lumpy mattress. She expected Silas to ignore it, to sleep through it as he seemed to sleep through everything. But in the middle of the night, she heard him rise. A scraping sound, and then his bed was being dragged across the floor, positioned next to hers. He didn't speak. He simply lay down on the dry side of his own bed, leaving the other half for her. She hesitated, the offer so unexpected it felt like a trap, but the cot was soaked and she was so cold. She rose and, in the darkness, carefully lay down on the edge of his bed. It was wide enough that they didn't touch, but she could feel his warmth, could hear the soft sound of his breathing. Beside her, it was the closest she had been to another human being in years. She lay stiffly, her muscles tensed, waiting for something. But nothing happened. He simply lay there, a silent breathing presence in the dark. And for the first time since she had arrived, she didn't feel entirely alone. She fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, the storm had passed. The world was washed clean, glistening under a pale sun. When she awoke, he was already gone. His bed was back in its proper place. But when she went outside, she saw him on the roof of the cabin, methodically replacing shingles, his hammer blows echoing in the crisp morning air. He worked all day, silent and focused, until the roof was whole again. That evening when he came down, tired and covered in tar, she had a steaming cup of chicory waiting for him on the table. He stopped, looked at the cup, then at her. His eyes held a flicker of surprise. He picked it up, his calloused fingers wrapping around the warm tin, and took a long drink. He gave her another one of his short, sharp nods. But this time, it felt different. It felt like a thank you. It was the first crack in the wall of silence between them. A few weeks later, Silas hitched the horses to the wagon. It was time to go to town for supplies. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. He didn't ask if she wanted to go. He simply waited for her to get on the wagon. The thought of returning to redemption, of facing the whispers and the stares, filled her with dread. But the thought of being left alone on the farm for an entire day was worse. She climbed onto the seat. The town was just as she remembered it, a single street of false-fronted buildings under a vast sky. As they rolled down the main street, the whispers started immediately. Heads turned. People stopped what they were doing to stare. There's Silas. He's got the thief with him. Look at her, shameless. Ilara kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap, her face burning. She could feel the weight of their judgment, a physical pressure. Silas pulled the wagon up in front of the mercantile. He climbed down and turned to her. "Stay here," he said, his voice low. He went inside, leaving her alone in the wagon, the town's unwilling spectacle once more. Sheriff Barlow came out of his office and sauntered over, a cruel smirk on his face. Well, he drawled, leaning against the wagon wheel. "Look what the cat dragged in. Enjoying your new life, girl? Playing house with the crazy farmer?" Ilara stared at the worn leather of the wagon seat, refusing to look at him. "He's a strange one, Silas," Barlow continued, his voice oily. "Been touched in the head ever since the fire. You watch yourself. A man that quiet, there's no telling what he's capable of." Just then, Silas came out of the mercantile, his arms loaded with sacks of flour and sugar. He saw Barlow, and his face hardened. He loaded the supplies into the back of the wagon, his movements deliberate. "Leave her be, Barlow," Silas said, his voice flat and cold. Barlow laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Just being neighborly, Silas. Making sure your property is behaving itself." He pushed himself off the wagon wheel and gave Ilara a final, contemptuous look before swaggering back to his office. Silas finished loading the supplies. As he was about to climb back onto the wagon, the mercantile door opened again. It was Mrs. Abernathy, the owner's wife, a small bird-like woman with kind eyes. She hurried over, clutching a small cloth-wrapped bundle. "Silas," she said, her voice a hushed whisper. She glanced nervously toward the sheriff's office. "This is for the girl." She pushed the bundle into his hands. "It's a dress. My daughter's outgrown it. It's nothing fancy, but it's clean and sturdy." Silas looked down at the bundle, then at the woman. He seemed at a loss for words. "Every soul deserves a bit of dignity," Mrs. Abernathy said softly, before scurrying back inside. Silas stood there for a moment, holding the dress. He then placed it carefully on the seat beside Ilara and climbed up. As they drove away, Ilara reached out and touched the rough-spun cloth of the dress. It was blue, the color of a summer sky. An act of kindness, a small rebellion against the town's cruelty. She looked at Silas, at his strong, silent profile, and saw that he was looking not at the road, but at her. In his pale eyes, for the briefest of moments, she saw not a master, but a protector. And she realized with a startling jolt that the farm, the cabin, the silence, it was beginning to feel less like a cage and more like a sanctuary. The blue dress changed things. It was a simple garment, a bit too short in the sleeves, but it was whole and clean, and it wasn't the ragged, dirt-stained dress of a prisoner. When she wore it, She felt a flicker of her old self, the girl who existed before the hunger and the shame. Silas didn't comment on it, but she saw him notice. She saw it in the way his gaze lingered for a second longer than usual when she came out of the cabin in the morning. The silence between them began to change, too. It was still there, a vast ocean of unspoken things, but the currents were different. It was less heavy, less oppressive. It became a shared silence, a space they inhabited together rather than separately. She started to take small initiatives. She found a patch of wild mint growing by the creek and began brewing tea in the evenings. She scrubbed the soot from the stones of the fireplace until they shone. She found a discarded tin and planted a few wildflowers she'd found, placing it on the windowsill. It was a small, defiant splash of color in the monochrome world of the cabin, and Silas let it stay. He, in turn, began to change in subtle ways. He built her a small shelf next to her cot for her few belongings. He started leaving an extra piece of jerky for her when he went out to check the fence lines. One day, he came back from the woods not with a rabbit, but with a handful of wild, sweet berries, which he left on the table without a word. They were small gestures, tiny seeds of tenderness planted in the hard, unforgiving soil of their lives. They developed a rhythm, a partnership born of necessity and proximity. They worked together to harvest the vegetables from the garden, their hands often brushing as they reached for the same potato or ear of corn. The first time it happened, she had flinched away, her skin tingling. But he hadn't reacted, and she slowly learned not to fear his touch. She learned the language of his movements, how the set of his shoulders told her he was tired, how the slight quickening of his pace meant a storm was coming. He, in turn, learned her. He learned that she hummed when she was content, that she had a fierce, stubborn pride that made her refuse help even when she was struggling. One afternoon, as she was mending one of his shirts, she pricked her finger with the needle. A small drop of blood welled up. She put the finger in her mouth, her eyes stinging with foolish tears of frustration. Silas was across the room, sharpening. His axe, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel, a constant backdrop to their days. He stopped. He walked over to her, took her hand gently in his, and examined the small wound. His touch was surprisingly soft. He went to a small shelf, took down a tin of salve that smelled of pine and herbs, and dabbed a small amount on her finger. "My wife used to make this," he said, his voice low and rough. It was the first time he had ever mentioned her directly. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and momentous. "What was her name?" Ilara asked, her own voice a whisper. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "Anna," he said, the name a puff of air, a ghost on his lips. Her name was Anna. He turned and went back to his axe, and the conversation was over. But the name remained, a seed planted in the silence, and Ilara knew that something profound had shifted. He had let her into his grief, just a crack, but it was enough. The community's perception of them began to slowly, almost imperceptibly change. When they went to town, the stares were still there, but they were more curious than hostile. The story of the blue dress had gotten around. Mrs. Abernathy would now greet Ilara with a small, tight smile. Mr. Abernathy would give Silas a better price on grain. A few of the other farmers, men who knew what it was to be isolated and at the mercy of the land, would nod a curt greeting to Silas, a gesture of respect they hadn't offered in years. But Sheriff Barlow's animosity only grew. He saw the change. He saw the life returning to Silas's eyes, the strength returning to Ilara's frame. He saw a homestead that was no longer dying, but beginning to thrive, and he hated it. Barlow had long coveted Silas's land. It wasn't the biggest or the richest plot, but it had something invaluable, the creek. It was fed by a deep, reliable spring that never ran dry, even in the worst droughts. The rest of the valley depended on a seasonal river that was already running low. Owning Silas's land meant controlling the water, and controlling the water meant controlling everything. He had assumed the grief-stricken farmer would eventually give up, sell for a pittance, or simply walk away. But now, with Ilara there, Silas had a reason to hold on. The girl was an anchor, rooting him to the land Barlow wanted. So Barlow began to spin a new story. He rode to the outlying farms, his voice full of false concern. "That girl Silas has," he'd say. "She's not just a petty thief. I've been hearing things. Word from the marshals back east. She's connected to the Clanton gang, the ones who robbed that stagecoach last spring. Silas is harboring a dangerous fugitive." It was a lie, a fabrication woven from malice and greed, but it was a seed of fear, and in the isolated, uncertain world of the frontier, fear grew fast. The whispers changed again. The curiosity in town was replaced by suspicion. The friendly nods from the other farmers ceased. The wall of isolation began to rebuild itself around Silas's farm, but this time, Ilara was incited with him. She saw the change in people's eyes, felt the renewed chill in the air. "They think I'm dangerous," she said to Silas one evening, as they sat by the fire. It was no longer a question. He looked at her, his face grim in the firelight. "Barlow wants this land," he said, his voice flat. "He'll use you to get it." "Then I should leave," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. The thought of leaving, of returning to the cold, hungry emptiness, was unbearable. But the thought of bringing disaster down on this man, this place that had become her sanctuary, was even worse. "I can't let him hurt you because of me." "No," Silas said, and the word was absolute. A stone dropped into a deep well. He looked around the small, warm cabin, at the pot of mint tea on the hearth, at the jar of wildflowers on the sill, at her. "He's not taking anything else from me." His eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw not just the ghosts of his past, but a fierce, protective fire for his present. "This is your home now, Ilara. We'll fight for it." The word home struck her with the force of a physical blow. He had never said it before. He had never given her anything more than a cot and a list of chores, but in that single word, he gave her everything. A place to belong, a reason to stand. She looked at this hard, silent man, at the scars on his arms and the grief in his eyes, and she felt a surge of emotion so powerful it stole her breath. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, something fiercer. It was love, a love forged not in whispered sweet nothings, but in shared silence, in common struggle, in the quiet, steady building of a life from the ashes of two broken ones. The first snow of winter had just begun to fall, dusting the brown earth with a delicate layer of white when they came. Ilara saw them first, a line of dark figures on horseback cresting the ridge to the east, their shapes stark against the gray morning sky. It was Barlow, and he had a posse with him, a dozen men from the town and surrounding area, their faces grim, their rifles held ready. They were not coming for a parley. They were coming for a war. "Silas," she breathed, her voice tight with fear. He was already at the door, his old hunting rifle in his hand. He had been expecting this. He looked at the approaching riders, his face a mask of cold resolve. He was no longer the stooped, haunted man she had first seen. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, a man defending his world. "Get in the root cellar," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. "Barricade the door. Don't come out, no matter what you hear." "No," she said, her own fear eclipsed by a terrifying clarity. "I'm not hiding. I won't let you face this alone." She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, its weight a small, cold comfort in her hand. "You said this was my home. I'll fight for it too." He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes, at the makeshift weapon in her hand. A flicker of something pride, fear, love crossed his face. He didn't have time to argue. The riders were getting closer, fanning out to surround the small cabin. He gave her a sharp nod. "Stay away from the window." The posse reined in their horses 100 yards from the cabin, a silent, menacing ring of men. Sheriff Barlow rode forward, his horse kicking up clumps of snow-dusted dirt. "Silas!" he bellowed, his voice echoing in the unnaturally quiet air. "It's over. I have a warrant for the girl, Elara May, wanted for robbery and accessory to murder. Give her up now, and I'll speak to the judge on your behalf. Harboring a fugitive is a serious crime." The lie was so audacious, so monstrous, it stole Elara's breath. Accessory to murder. He was trying to get them both hanged. Silas stepped out onto the small porch, his rifle held loosely at his side, but ready. "There's no fugitive here, Barlow," he called back, his voice steady and clear. "Only my wife." The words shot through the cold air like a bullet. Elira's heart stopped. Wife. He had said wife. It was a shield, a claim, a declaration of war. In the cabin, she pressed her hand to her mouth, the poker forgotten, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a wild, soaring hope. Barlow laughed. A nasty, incredulous sound. "Wife, you expect anyone to believe that? You bought her for 5 cents at a public shaming. There's no marriage record, no preacher who'll vouch for you." "We don't need a preacher to sanctify what's right," Silas yelled back, his voice ringing with a conviction that made the air vibrate. "This is my land. This is my home. And this is my family. You are not welcome here. Leave now." "That's your final word?" Barlow sneered, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. "It is." The tension stretched, thin and taut, ready to snap. The men in the posse shifted uneasily in their saddles. They were farmers and ranchers, not killers. They had come for a fugitive, but the man standing on that porch was not a criminal. He was one of them, a man defending his home. They looked at Barlow, then back at Silas, and the certainty in their eyes began to waver. Suddenly, another sound cut through the silence. The thud of hoofbeats, coming not from the posse, but from the west, from the direction of the town. 3 riders crested the hill. It was Mr. Abernathy from the Mercantile, his face pale but determined. Beside him was the farmer who had started nodding to Silas again, and another, a grizzled old rancher whose land bordered Silas's to the north. They rode not to join the posse, but to stop beside Silas's fence line, placing themselves between the cabin and Barlow's men. "What is this, Abernathy?" Barlow roared, his face turning a blotchy red. "This is official business." "It's a disgrace, is what it is," Abernathy called back, his reedy voice filled with an uncharacteristic strength. "We know that girl ain't no murderer. We saw her starving in the square. And we know you, Barlow. We know you've been after this land for years. We're not going to be a part of your land grab. This man, Silas, has shown more decency in the last few months than you have in your whole life," the other farmer added, spitting a wad of tobacco into the snow. "We stand with him." Barlow was apoplectic. His authority, his carefully constructed lie, was dissolving in the cold morning air. He was being defied, not just by the broken-down recluse, but by the very town he thought he controlled. His face contorted in a mask of pure hatred. He drew his pistol. "He's resisting arrest. She's a fugitive. Fire!" he screamed, his voice cracking with fury, but no one fired. The men in the posse looked at each other, at the 3 men standing with Silas, at Barlow's crazed expression. They saw the truth. This wasn't about justice. It was about greed. One by one, they lowered their rifles. A quiet mutiny, a rebellion of conscience. Barlow stood alone, his pistol aimed at the cabin, his posse melting away behind him. He looked at Silas, at the unyielding man on the porch, and he knew he had lost. With a final guttural cry of rage, he fired his pistol wildly into the air, wheeled his horse around, and galloped away, a lone, defeated figure disappearing into the falling snow. The silence that descended was profound. It was the silence of a battle won without a war, of a community choosing decency over fear. Alara slowly opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the porch, the cold air sharp on her face. Silas turned to her, his rifle hanging forgotten in his hand. He looked at her, his pale eyes filled with a storm of emotions she could finally read: relief, terror, and a love so deep and powerful it was like the land itself, solid and enduring. He reached out and pulled her to him, his arms wrapping around her in a fierce, trembling embrace. He buried his face in her hair, and she could feel the shudder that ran through his entire body. He was holding her as if she were the only thing keeping him from blowing away in the wind. And she held him back, her arms wrapped around his strong back, her face pressed against the rough wool of his coat, breathing in the scent of him, of wood smoke and pine and home. Across the snowy field, Mr. Abernathy and the other men watched for a moment. Then, with a quiet nod, they turned their horses and rode away, leaving the two of them alone in their sanctuary. They were married in the spring, when the wildflowers she had planted on the windowsill had spread to the ground below, creating a carpet of defiant color. The preacher came out from a town 20 miles away, a kind man with gentle eyes who didn't ask any questions. Their witnesses were the Abernathys and the 2 farmers who had stood with them. It wasn't a grand affair. It was held under the old oak tree at the edge of the property, the same tree that had once shaded a grieving man and now shaded a new family. Alara wore the blue dress, mended and clean. Silas wore a new shirt that she had made for him. He had built a new room onto the cabin. His hammer blows a happy, rhythmic sound throughout the late winter. The house was filled with warmth now, with the smell of baking bread and the sound of quiet laughter. The ghosts were still there, in the silver locket she had polished and placed on the mantelpiece, in the small wooden bird that sat beside it. But they were no longer haunting specters. They were memories, honored and loved, a part of the story of the home, not the whole of it. The town of Redemption had a new sheriff, a younger, fairer man, and Barlow was just a bitter memory. The community, having found its conscience, had found its way back to them. People would stop by, not with suspicion, but with offerings, a jar of preserves, a new strain of seed, a bit of friendly gossip. They had been broken, the 2 of them, shattered by loss and cruelty. But here, in the vast, open heart of the frontier, they had taken the broken pieces of their lives and built something new, something stronger. That evening, after the small celebration, after their friends had gone, Silas and Alara stood on the porch, watching the sun set, the sky painted in the same brutal, beautiful colors as the day they had first met. His arm was around her, his hand resting on the slight swell of her belly. A new life, a new hope growing within her. He had saved her from starvation, from a death of shame in a dusty square. But she had saved him from a silence far more deadly, a quiet so profound it had nearly erased him from the world. And in the vast, unforgiving quiet of the frontier, 2 broken souls, against all odds, had finally and forever found the sound of home.